or this one. All were big hits. All made the national airwaves, and all came out of Chicago.
The kids went nuts, so we got their songs on.
Number one requested. I went crazy.
They had never had the kind of record sales they had with Chicago.
This is Bob Surratt. How Chicago rocked the 60s, next on Chicago Stories.
Good evening, I'm John Calloway, and welcome to Chicago Stories. Teenagers in the mid-1960s had their transistor radios and 45 RPM records to listen to music that drove their parents crazy. Rock and roll, 60s style, featured the Beatles, who led what was called the British invasion of American popular music. But Chicago wasn't simply content to give the English newcomers the whole stage. Across the city and suburbs, young musicians, most still in their teens, formed bands and cut records that became hits from coast to coast. Well, Bob Surratt grew up with the music before launching his career as a Chicago disc jockey. Here's Bob with the story of this pop culture phenomenon.
February 7th, 1964, the Beatles landed in America. And it seemed like every young white high school-age male wanted to start a band. Soon, new rock and roll groups were coming together to play in garages, basements, and living rooms all around Chicago.
Up to that point, the instrument of choice for most kids, or at least their parents, was the accordion. The accordion was the big thing that everybody wanted to learn. But of course, after the Beatles, guitars were flying off the wall.
Every block, there was a group. I lived in the northwest suburbs, and you can drive down any block any given night and hear some band rehearsing in the basement. And I've heard some great bands that never made it out of the basement.
First stop out of the basement was usually the high school gym. That was the beginning for the band that launched Chicago's rock revolution. The Patsmen from St. Patrick High School eventually took the name New Colony 6 as their answer to the British invasion.
The first performance we ever did was St. Pat's High School last senior concert in 1964, and we did a live version of I Want to Hold Your Hand. And of the 6 guys who did it, 5 of the 6 became the New Colony 6, and the 6th guy lived too far away, so we didn't let him join.
In Berwyn, a group of friends who started a band were figuring out how to have long hair like the Beatles in spite of the grooming code at their high school.
Morton West policy, you had to have the hair over the collar and the whole bit. And our manager, our genius manager at the time, who remained nameless, said, you guys got to go out and you got to get wigs. So we went to the wigwam.
The band that would later become Chicago started out in 1967 calling themselves The Big Thing. They were students at DePaul who worked their way downtown, eventually making the city's name their own.
I booked the band in the gin mills and the upholstered sewers, as my dad says, who's been a professional trumpet player for 66 years. So, you know, we couldn't get arrested in the city at first. We worked Rockford, Milwaukee, Madison, and all of that stuff. And then we made our name in, down on State Street at Barnaby's.
The Centuries, later known as the Pulsations, and finally the Buckinghams, played dance halls like the Holiday Ballroom. The band caught a big break when it won an audition for a nationally syndicated variety show on WGN television.
I should have known better with a girl like you, that I would love everything that you do, and I do, hey, and I do.
We were the token rock band because it was a real hit parade type show, and so whatever the top hits
top
were,
three songs we would have to play those, or they would bring like singers in, would be a guest singer, so we would back them up, and then we would do our little portion of the show.
The group had the Beatles sound and were about to get a name that matched.
It was a security guard that worked for the show, came up with a couple names, and the one that we liked was the Buckingham. That sounds cool. It sounds real British.
It was one thing to play somebody else's hits on television or headline school dances and pack them in at the VFW hall, but it was quite another to actually cut your own record and get it played on the radio. But Chicago in the mid-60s was a place where dreams could and did come true. Even before 1964, Chicago was known for musical talent that came almost exclusively from the black community. This was the home of modern blues, and the British groups felt the influence. Famous names such as Muddy Waters, Howlin' Wolf, Willie Dixon, Bo Diddley, Curtis Mayfield, and Jerry Butler recorded music in Chicago studios that was heard worldwide. And rhythm and blues stations like Chicago's WVON helped popularize them. The new sound, however, had a different audience.
It was a white phenomenon, there's no question about it. Many black people wouldn't even know what the Buckinghams were. You'd probably say, what, is that the fountain downtown?
The Buckinghams and other new Chicago area groups were about to gain a national stage with the help of local radio. WLS had dominated the ratings for young listeners since 1960. Its weekly list of best-selling records, the Silver Dollar Survey, was the official scorecard of top 40 hits. But in 1965, WCFL radio switched to a top 40 format. Now, there were two 50,000-watt AM stations battling for rock fans. At night, both had powerful signals that were heard across the country.
WCFL, that's where it's at.
If you went to any of the teen clubs, all of these groups, they had a big fan base, and they were listeners. If you were CFL or LS, you wanted to get all those kids on your side.
WLS and WCFL, number one, they were powerhouse stations. So if you're a local band getting on CFL or LS in the mid-60s, it was a great stepping stone to having it break nationally.
Disc jockeys who were emceeing dances featuring local bands also had a say in what records would get on the air. They realized they could build their audience by playing songs recorded by the stars of Chicago's booming music scene.
Every night I hope and pray your sweet love will come my way. Now you're here, I felt your touch. I love you so much.
The New Colony Six tried and failed to land a recording contract in California, so they took matters into their own hands with a little family help.
When we came back, my dad heard some of the material, and he decided that our material was so good, somebody should record us. And since nobody would, he said, I'll start a record company.
The primitive recording of their song, I Confess, was released in December of 1965 and hit number 2 on WLS in early '66. It made the New Colony Six the first of the local bands to get on the air.
I confess to have a willingness and wanting for you.
I was on the Kennedy Expressway. I had a 1959 Triumph, and I took the side curtain. I said, I'm on the radio! Turn on WLS! It was about 11 o'clock at night, and it was one of the request things.
Towards the end of that year, 1966, the Buckinghams' recording contract with Chicago-based USA Records had just about ended when they struck gold, too.
Kind of a Drag was one of 4 songs on a tape that was hand-delivered to us by a guy named Jim Holvey. No offense, Jimmy, but the songs and it was just awful.
It was just him strumming on a guitar
and singing these words.
The performance on that tape might have been lacking, but the 4 songs were impressive. Don't You Care, Susan, Hey Baby They're Playing Our Song, and Kind of a Drag, which went all the way to number 1 from coast to coast.
Kind of a drag when your baby don't love you. Kind of a drag when you know she's been untrue.
Here to entertain you are the Buckinghams.
The Buckinghams.
The Buckinghams.
Network television appearances and a national recording contract followed. The Buckinghams were now playing in the major leagues.
If you don't love me, why don't you tell me? Instead of running around the guys in town, can't you see? You're hurting me, don't you care?
If the Buckinghams were the big-time Beatlesque mods of Chicago,
Whoa, yeah.
then the Shadows of Night were definitely the scrappy rockers from the northwest suburbs. They modeled themselves after Mick Jagger and the Rolling Stones, whom they opened for in the summer of '66.
Jagger told me that we were going to be really big because we were from Chicago. And he said, you make it from New York and you spread in about a third of the country. You make it from LA and you spread out about a third of the country. But when you make it from Chicago, you go a third each way and you got 2/3 of the country. He said, you make it in the Midwest and you're really going to make it.
And the Shadows of Night were the first of the Chicago bands to make it to the national charts with Gloria in '66. The group's big break came from WLS morning jock and program director Clark Weber. Weber had been playing the original version of Gloria by Van Morrison's group, Them, a record whose lyrics parents found objectionable.
Knock on the door, into her bedroom, we rolled around. I decided that we couldn't play that record in good conscience with that line in it. So I suggested somebody put that song together and eliminate that lyric line. And Bill Trout and the Shadows of Night, next morning at 8 o'clock, came in with an acetate of that record without that line in it. So we put it on the air, and the rest is history.
And her name is G. L. O.
The station with personality, WLS, in Chicago.
Hey, well, I'm a friendless stranger in the black sedan. Won't you hop inside my car? I got pictures, got candy, I'm a lovable man, and I can take you to the nearest star. I'm your vehicle, baby.
They may be best remembered for their 1970 hit Vehicle, but in the 60s, the Ides of March was just another local group from the western suburbs, benefiting from the small-town feeling of the radio and record industry here.
Great God in heaven, you know I love.
That whole Chicago thing, it was a kind of a family. I mean, we knew all the bands, we knew all the other, New Colony 6, the Chicago people, everybody, and we all kind of grew up together, and the disc jockeys were with us. They were helping to support the bands.
It was a time when many record labels were still based in Chicago. Before becoming the Ides of March, this group took a recording to a local record executive named Dutch Winslow, who agreed to hear the kids live in the Peterick family's Berwyn basement.
Probably my 15th birthday, we had an all-night sleepover where we wanted to work out a couple more to play for Dutch, and one of those songs was He Wouldn't Listen. We're still called the Shondells, and I remember we stayed up till like 4 in the morning working out this song. We finally crashed, went to sleep, woke up. He came in around 11, 12 o'clock. We played it for him. He said, add a modulation to that song, and it's a #1 record. We said, what's a modulation? Well, that's where you shift it up a key, half step. Yeah. And he showed us how to do that. And we go, yeah. And it worked.
You wouldn't listen to me. You break your heart. You wouldn't listen to me.
While the Ides of March were working their way up in the summer of '66, the city was exploding with new bands, boosted by radio, here and eventually stations around the country. The Battle of the Bands became a staple of the entertainment scene. Many of the local groups admired another Chicago band whose record got on the radio later that summer.
They were on stage, plugged in, and playing within 5 seconds. And they start, I first saw you in a magazine, I want to meet you. Woo! We always looked up to the Cryan Shames. The Ides of March always wanted to harmonize as well as the Cryan Shames.
I first saw you in a magazine,
I Want to Meet You was the second hit for the Cryan Shames from Hinsdale. Their first record, Sugar and Spice, made it to number 49 on the national charts and got this group of local teens a contract with one of the country's major labels.
Sugar and spice and all things nice.